Hello, everybody. Hello, my name is Maeve Cook. I am the chair of the Royal Irish Academy Ethical, Political, Legal and Philosophical Committee, and I'm also a professor of philosophy at University College Dublin. It's my pleasure and my honor to welcome you all today to this very timely and, for me anyway, exciting event. The title, as you know, is How Should a Liberal Democracy React to Conscientious Objection Claims? The event is hosted by the Royal Irish Academy and organised by the committee that I'm chair of. I am, so to speak, the overall chair of this afternoon, but each of the four panels is chaired by a different person. So my task, having welcomed you all now, is to introduce the chair of the first panel, the first of our four panels. That panel is called Concepts of Conscience. The chair of that panel will introduce the panelists. So without further ado, I'd like to pass you over to the chair, who is Professor Bert Gordijn of Dublin City University. He's a professor and director of the Institute of Ethics there at Dublin City University. He's also president of the International Association of Education in Ethics, and he is secretary of the European Society for the Philosophy of Medicine and Healthcare. So I'll pass myself over to and you over to Bert now. Thank you, and very welcome to you all.
Thank you, Maeve. The pronunciation of my surname was absolutely perfect, and it's very difficult because it's a Dutch name. So welcome everybody to the first panel of today's webinar. This is arguably the most philosophical panel, and it's meant to set the stage for the subsequent three panels. We have two magnificent speakers whom I would like to introduce very briefly. So the first speaker will be Kimberley Brownlee. She is a professor of philosophy at the University of British Columbia. Her current work focuses on loneliness, belonging, social human rights, and interactional ethics. Her other work focuses on conscience, conviction, principled disobedience to the law. She is the author of Being Sure of Each Other, published last year, and Conscience and Conviction, The Case for Civil Disobedience, published in 2012, both by Oxford University Press. The second speaker in this panel is Katherine Furman. She is the Philosophy, Politics and Economics lecturer at the University of Liverpool. Prior to this, she was the director of the MA in Health and Society at University College Cork here in Ireland. She works broadly on philosophy and health policy with a special interest in relationships between experts and lay people, and on health policy development. She did her PhD in philosophy at the London School of Economics on AIDS denialism in South Africa. So both speakers will talk for about 15 minutes, hopefully leaving us some time for discussion. And so without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Kimberley Brownlee.
Thank you, Bert, for that kind introduction. I will share my screen. The idea I would like to share is that there are two conceptions of conscience. That is my task, to provide a conceptual framework of what conscience means, so that when we get into the more practical and political discussions about conscientious objection, we have a clear working idea of the core concept. And I'll start by sharing an image that there are two very lovely quotations that I find very entertaining when you think of conscience. So one is from Mencken conscience is the inner voice that warns you someone may be looking. And the other is from Nietzsche. It is easier to cope with a bad conscience than with a bad reputation. Now, both of those, they're facetious, but there's a bit of a sting, and it's an interesting question. What do we do when conscience confronts status? And some very impressive people who sort of put their lives on the line seem to prioritize conscience over how other people view them. Now, the two conceptions of conscience I'm going to outline, they can both be found in a lovely painting by Norman Rockwell. This is his The Jury. And in it, we have 11 men and 1 woman. 10 of the men stand around her. Their jackets have been taken off. There's smoke in the room. We have wood paneling. It looks a bit like a men's club. There's one man who's sleeping. He's dozing to the side, couldn't care less. And the men around the woman, they seem to be united in their view, and they seem to be trying to convince her. And she sits there in her rickety chair, her back is straight, her arms are folded. She's listening to them, but you can see that she has some confidence, that she has her own view. And the two conceptions of conscience I want to outline, they follow 2 paths. One is the case in which she's right, and the other is the case in which she's not. So the first conception of conscience we can call an objective conception. The idea that conscience is moral wisdom. So conscience as conscientia, with knowledge, being privy to, having deep moral understanding. And this conception of conscience we can think of as the angel on the shoulder, the inner guide that warns us when we're going wrong. The other conception, where she's not right in the jury scene, or whether it's not clear if she's right, is that of sincere moral conviction. And this we get in the famous idea of, here I stand, I can do no other. But of course, my saying, here I stand, I can do no other, that signals that I think I'm right. I believe my sincere moral conviction is actually moral knowledge, but it doesn't mean I'm right. And both of these conceptions of conscience, we use them in our common sense, ordinary discussions about conscientious objection. We have the idea of the angel on the shoulder, but we also have the idea of someone having a deep belief that we think is mistaken, but that we should tolerate. And one thing I found very fascinating when I started to look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is that both of these conceptions of conscience pop up in that document. And I think there's an equivocation in the usage of the term conscience. So in the UDHR preamble, there's an explanation of why this declaration has been developed. And it says that disregard and contempt for human rights have resulted in barbarous acts that have outraged the conscience of mankind. And that idea that the conscience of mankind has been outraged, that is a normative statement, that we have rightly been shocked and horrified by some events, that we have moral knowledge, we have moral wisdom that things have gone wrong and we need a Declaration of Human Rights. And Article 1 continues in a similar vein. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. And again, with that thought of we should act toward each other in a spirit of brotherhood, that's part of our conscience and reason to know that again is an objective conception. We have some moral knowledge here. Our conscience means we understand what matters morally. But then if you go forward in the UDHR and you get to Article 18, you get a descriptive use of the term conscience, that everyone has the right to freedom of thought, conscience, and religion. And this right includes the freedom to change your religion or your belief. And to my mind, that is the subjective conception being used. That is saying you have a right to believe things deeply, even if you're mistaken. So you have a right to sincere moral conviction and belief and a religion, but you might be wrong about what you believe. And the fact that you might change it may be one indicator that you may have thought you were wrong, or others may think you are wrong, and that you may form a new belief, which again might also be wrong. So I want to flesh out these two conceptions of conscience and look at how we use them in debates about conscientious objection. And I think both of these conceptions, they have some common elements. The first is that this is a form of moral self-judgment. When I say, here I stand, I can do no other, or I know that there's an angel on the shoulder, that we all understand something matters morally, that is a form of moral self-judgment. And there's this second piece that is, this is a genuine or a believed source of moral knowledge. Now I'll start with the subjective conception as moral conviction. There are lots of examples of people saying through their actions, here I stand, I can do no other. Examples of doctors refusing to perform abortions, citizens refusing a draft call, a grocery store clerk refusing to process the sale of alcohol, an employee refusing to remove a headscarf, or refusing to wear a face mask, or refusing to remove a necklace with a cross on it. A city councillor refusing to administer same-sex partnership ceremonies. A baker refusing to make a cake with a same-sex couple on the top. And a religious parent refusing to take her child to the doctor because she believes healing should be done through prayer alone. These are all examples of people saying, I have a deep moral belief, I believe it's correct, and I cannot do other than as I am doing. Now, there's different ways of fleshing out what it is to have a sincere moral belief, to be conscientious. And I'll summarize C.D. Broad's account and my own. C.D. Broad says there are three dispositions that go with, now he uses the term conscience, but we're here talking about sincere moral conviction. First is a cognitive disposition. So this is about beliefs and reflection. You have a disposition to reflect on your own actions, your motives, your values, to assess whether in your view they're right or wrong, good or bad. You also have an emotional disposition. If you have a sincere moral conviction, then you tend to feel remorse or guilt or moral reproval to the extent that you honor your conviction. And third, you have a conative disposition, an action-related disposition, to seek what we believe to be good, to shun what we believe to be bad, to do what we believe to be right, and to avoid what we believe to be wrong. Now, those three dispositions, I'll sort of tuck them in the back of our minds for a minute, because they'll come up again at the end of my talk when I ask the question, could corporate bodies have conscience? My own account of what it is to have a sincere conviction has four elements, and I'll just flag them very briefly. Essentially, to be sincere and serious in your moral belief, you aim to fit your actions with your beliefs. You judge everyone by the same moral standards, And crucially, in my view, you don't try to evade the consequences of what you believe. So Gandhi, one of his well-known quotes was, "My life is my message." And to my mind, the people who can best claim the term conscientious are the people who are willing to be seen. So that list of people I gave, of people who've said, "Here I stand, I can do no other," some of those people do it surreptitiously. So there have been city council clerks who've quietly swapped assignments with a colleague so they didn't have to perform a same-sex partnership ceremony, or doctors and nurses who quietly swap assignments so they don't have to be part of abortion service. To my mind, that is not as conscientious as the person who takes the risks of holding to their belief, is willing to be seen, and who actually tries to engage other people in reflection about their view, who tries to engage others in a dialogue. Turning very briefly to the objective conception, the idea of conscience as moral wisdom, there's a range of interesting views in the literature, in philosophy. Joseph Butler thinks that conscience is an unerring faculty of cool and reflective reason, essentially the voice of God. But it's impotent, it cannot move us. Our emotions have to be in play for us to follow conscience. Immanuel Kant thinks conscience comes in after the fact. So after we've done something wrong, our conscience will be that internal tribunal before which our thoughts accuse or excuse each other. And so conscience is backward looking. It tells us how we acted wrongly. I've included a Kantian variation from Thomas Hill, which tries to allow that we're fallible. So it's our best moral judgments, reflective, reason-based, but there is an appreciation that we don't have perfect knowledge. And so our conscience is, a clear conscience, is one that's founded on the best information we have. And then finally, my own view of conscience is that we need to situate it within what is known as moral pluralism, that there's often no one right way to act, and that often our choices are tragic, that we will get something wrong no matter what we do. And so in my view, conscience is deep moral understanding. It's understanding of the values in play, of sort of the best way to prioritize them as we can, and an appreciation of how we ought to act, what the demands of conscience will be when we're confronting a variety of values and conflicting demands. So those are two conceptions of conscience, the angel on the shoulder versus here I stand, I can do no other, but I might be mistaken. And then I want to briefly address this question that Maeve posed in the overview for the session, which was, who can have a conscience? Is it just individual people, or could also corporate bodies? Now, the accounts I've given of sincere moral conviction would suggest it's only individual people. That you have to have certain dispositions, to have certain beliefs, certain emotions, certain orientation in your behavior. And so when we get big statements like, our church believes X is unacceptable, we have to unpack that and look behind it. Who is doing the believing? Who is going to show non-evasion and engage in dialogic effort? Of course, if you think again to the Norman Rockwell painting, the 10 men standing around the woman did appear to be united in their conviction. They did appear to be a collective that had a sincere view of how to act. With respect to the objective conception, again, there's a good question to ask of whether a collective can have moral wisdom. When we as a society know something's wrong, when our conscience as humanity has been offended, as it was in the case of the Second World War and the Holocaust, are we as a collective displaying conscience, or is it an aggregation of individuals? And we all each have to hold ourselves to account for what we know and how deeply we know it. I'm inclined to say that it is individuals, an aggregation of individuals who can have conscience in either sense. But certainly in how we show it, the actions we take, like setting up a universal declaration, that is a collective enterprise. That is a collective manifestation of individual conscience. Okay, thank you very much. I'll just pass over to Katherine now, who will give the second presentation.
Thank you so much. I'm just sharing my screen. And I'm setting a timer to make sure that I don't ramble. All right, good afternoon. Thank you so much for having me. It's delightful to be back in Ireland. Of course, it would be much better if I was in Dublin in person, but it's still a great honor to be here. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a philosopher that works on public policy. So a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is from the imaginative standpoint of the policymaker trying to grapple with conscientious objection from various levels. So starting out very broadly about what I take conscientious objection to be. At its absolute heart, conscientious objection is about a refusal to perform or participate in certain activities on value-based grounds. And so there are lots of ways in which I can refuse to perform or participate in actions. Perhaps I'm just a very contrarian kind of person. That's not going to cut it to be a conscientious objection claim. It has to be deeply rooted in value. And of course, conscientious objection is very closely related to other concepts in the world and in philosophy, things like civil disobedience, which isn't necessarily about my not doing an action, but is about thinking that something that is happening out there in the world is wrong and making that known, and protest, which is a more generalized category that can encompass these things. And these are fuzzy categories: conscientious objection, civil disobedience, and protest. There are murky boundaries between them, and sometimes there'll be substantial overlap between them. Part of what I want to emphasize in the brief talk that I'm giving you today is that there are going to be a variety of contexts, social locations, and actors who can engage in conscientious objection. And what looks like to be an objector in various positions is very different depending on what the motivations are, where you're located socially, and all of this contextual information changes the way that we view it. And so part of what I have is a diverse view of what these different kinds of actors might look like. But overall, the central message is one of non-compliance. So there are two idealized ways in which we can look at this, or at least for the purposes of my talk: citizens who are non-compliant, who refuse to perform actions, and street level professionals. And I'll say a little bit more about what I mean about that later. This is obviously an idealized structure. People typically, have multiple identities. One is obviously both a citizen and a street level professional when they're a street level professional. But when people have these different kinds of role hats on, they're performing different kinds of work. So let's start by looking at the role of citizens who refuse to participate and non-comply in actions in those ways. So part of the brief for today is that we're not just looking at conscientious objection in the abstract, we're looking at it in the context of deliberative democracies. And so saying a little bit more about deliberative democracies before we get to the issue of citizens. So it's very easy to be a deliberative democracy if you have a homogeneous society. So if people are all very similar within your society, there's going to be very little disagreement. People agree on things in terms of value. Perhaps there's not very much inequality. Very little disagreement. It's easy to have a deliberative democracy. This becomes substantially more challenging when there's heterogeneity within your society, when there's a lot of difference. And they're going to be very big challenges to having a successful deliberative democracy when you have deep value differences, deep disagreement between groups. And it's going to be harder even still when certain groups and certain individuals have limited access to democratic institutions. And I don't just mean the ability to vote, although sometimes that is also hard and challenging sometimes, but really access to the kinds of conversations that decide what policy is going to be. And so you have situations where you don't have a lot of access to democracy, and then there's an expectation that you must comply with the rules that are being created by that system, and that's going to be a problem. So I want to talk to you a little bit about a case, which I think makes the access to democracy point clear and how that can lead to a withdrawal of participation in certain kinds of activity. So the very cool rock star looking photograph at the top of the page there is of Spuza Cody. He's the unofficial leader of the South African Shack Dwellers movement, an organization that's been in existence for quite a while now, precisely because they don't have good access to democratic structures. And so I'm going to read this little quote out to you, which explains the kind of sense of distance from democracy that people like Spuza Cody and the people that he represents have. So he says, "We discovered that our municipality doesn't listen to us when we speak in Zulu. We tried English. Now we realize that they don't understand Xhosa or Sotho either. These are all very commonly spoken languages in South Africa. The only language that they understand is when we put thousands of people on the street. We've seen the results of this and we've been encouraged. It works very well. It's the only tool that we have to emancipate our people. Why should we stop?" And this is in a document that he wrote in 2006 called We the Third Force. And in this document, he's explaining the rationale for why the Shack Dwellers movement exists. It exists because their official representatives just haven't listened to them. They've tried all of the languages and no one has paid any attention. At about the same time that he wrote the quote that I read on the previous screen, there was a campaign put together by the Shack Dwellers movement in South Africa called No Land, No House, No Vote. And precisely in response to the being ignored by policy actors, being made to live consistently in bad conditions, this group of people, of which there were thousands, withdrew their vote. They just refused to participate in democratic structures. So, Introduction to Political Philosophy 101, what gives the state legitimacy is that we participate in these various democratic structures. This group of people said, we haven't been able to effectively participate, our councillors don't listen to us, and so we are going to withdraw from this. So go back to what I said about conscientious objection at the beginning. It's about refusing to perform activities, refusal to participate in certain things. And so here we have en masse people refusing to participate in the democratic structure itself. So here's another protest photograph, more recent in time and closer in geographical distance. This was taken a few months ago in the city of Liverpool, where I live. And at one point, at the height of the COVID crisis, there was basically a weekly protest that would happen down the main street of the city of Liverpool. That was notionally an anti-lockdown protest, but as you can see from the placard and the photograph, which I've stolen from the Liverpool Echo, it was also about refusing to wear masks. It was about refusing to get tested for the virus. It was also some conspiratorial thinking there about microchipping to go along with the vaccine. But again, this is about a protest about withdrawing public participation in the policy process. And one way of reacting to photographs like this, I mean, is that these people are ignorant, they are behaving badly, they're breaking the law. I mean, lots of people got arrested at this particular protest. There were 13 people who were arrested. The week before that, 27 people were arrested, and people are breaking the law here. But I think once we look at this in context, the city of Liverpool is one that historically has been betrayed by a conservative government. There's still considerable suspicion that the government is acting in the people's interest. There's a sense that policy gets made in London, but doesn't make it up to the north. It doesn't take northern considerations seriously. That once we've taken all of this into context, that this looks a little bit more complicated, and it looks perhaps closer to the photograph before, where people feel excluded from the policymaking process and as a result withdraw their willingness to participate. And I'm not entirely sure that that's the right reading of the Liverpool protests. I think we need some social scientists to do a study on this. But I do think that it's probably more complicated than people just willfully breaking the law or being ignorant of the science. Okay, so why should we care about this? Why should we care about people protesting in various parts of the world at various times, withdrawing their compliance with policy measures? Well, I think if just we are purely pragmatic about this, is that in order for policy to succeed, we need to have public participation. We can have, to take one example of vaccination, because it's very close to many people's hearts at the moment, we can have the best vaccines developed, we can have the best vaccination program, but if nobody shows up to be vaccinated, that's been a failure at the policy level. In order for policy to work, we need to have public participation. We can't have people withdrawing and refusing to participate. And so I think that we need to have good understandings of why people are doing what they're doing in order to make sure that we can have more successful policy interventions on that. All right, so I've spoken a bit about people objecting and withdrawing their participation at the level of being citizens. We're going to shift perspective a little bit now and look at conscientious objection within professions, because I think many people in the audience here today are interested in professional conscientious objection. So one thing that conscientious objection at the professional level has going for it is that it makes values more transparent. And so it is very well accepted in philosophy of science and social science that there's no value-free position that can be adopted in pretty much anything. There's no God's eye view. That's why I've got the picture there. We can imagine God having this, objective view of the world in this way. And I think it's now pretty much accepted that there is just no way to have a value-free position. We all enter the world and our various roles in the world heavily value-laden. We go with our values attached to us. There's no way to scrub off our values as we enter the workplace. And this can be a problem that we're all going around with these values when the values are opaque or perhaps particularly suspicious to ordinary members of the public. This can cause problems with trust in professionals and in science. There are problems when values are opaque in this way. And so one thing that seems to be good about conscientious objection from the professional side is that at least in those instances, those values are clear, or at least in instances where people declare that they are acting in this way or not acting in this way because they are conscientious objectors. And so instead of being in a position when there's uncertainty about what people's values are, and if they're in fact acting in the best interests of the citizen in the situation or acting in their own interests or in the interests of their conscience, at least conscientious objection, at least when it's declared, makes those values more transparent and can be good for cultivating trust. And in the bracket there, I've got assuming that this is done in good faith, because I have heard accounts of people using conscientious objection claims that they're using one set of values, but really they're doing something else. So at least if it's declared and at least if it's in good faith, that gives us value transparency, which is good for things like trust in various institutions. A different perspective that we can take on this is by looking more closely at the moral lives of the people who operate in these positions. And here I'm borrowing some work from Bernardo Zacca, who's an interesting philosopher who's done ethnographies on people who work in benefits offices in the United States. And he isn't interested in conscientious objection clearly, like that's not the thing that's at the front of his mind when he's writing, but he does give us this very detailed ethnographic account of the moral lives of street level workers. And what I'm talking about there, and I said at the beginning that I'd come back to this term, are the people that we expect to implement our policies for us. And so if we imagine that we are the policymakers, we make the policies, we need to have citizens participate in our policies in order for them to succeed, but we also need to have people who are going to implement the policies participate as well, because they're not going to succeed if we don't have that kind of participation. But part of what Zacca makes clear to us is that the moral lives of street level workers are complicated sometimes. And one of the examples he talks us through is in Arizona. Looking at the police force, there was a change in legislation which introduced the show us your papers provision in migration policy, which meant that police officers were required by the law to go up to anyone that they thought looked kind of foreign and demand that they show them their papers so that they could be deported if they were in the country illegally. And this caused immense moral distress for people who were working in these roles, because they saw it as being in tension with their role as police officers, which they saw as requiring the trust of the populations in which they worked. And if they were going to go demand that they show them their papers, this would undo that trust and make their jobs less effective in that way. But it wasn't just about the effectiveness of doing the job, it was also about like how morally tense people felt about doing both of these things. And so I'm very close to the end now, I promise. I'm quickly going to read this quote out. For most people, inhabiting the role is not something that can be done at arm's length. It involves a change in how one understands and sees oneself. When impossible situations force agents to take actions that are irreconcilable with their role conception, they force them to jeopardize that. Such situations put workers in conflict with their own selves. An impossible situation threatens one's sense of moral integrity. And so, and this is where I'm going to wrap up, really. Some points to take from this is that people enter roles with various senses of the moral identity attached to them, especially if they're things that are vocational, like being a police officer, you want to keep people safe. Being a medical practitioner, you want to help people live healthier lives. And changes in those roles can conflict with both how they see themselves within that role, but how they see themselves morally in the rest of their lives. And when people like Zaka write about these things, they talk about there being two options that the street level worker can have. They can exit, they can leave the job, or they can voice their options, or they can voice their objections. Pragmatically, it's going to be really bad if all of your policy implementers leave. Before I did my PhD in philosophy, I worked a bit in health in South Africa, and it was a real concern that if too many doctors left the profession, that it was just going to be impossible to have a public health service. But also it's morally bad if you expect your policy implementers to live their lives in these emotionally and morally divided ways. So even if it wasn't pragmatically worrying, it's going to be worrying for other reasons, like forcing people to live these morally divided lives. Policy requires that people implement it, and conscientious objection might allow professionals to stay in their roles and maintain their sense of moral integrity from their own perspectives. So in conclusion, policy requires that we have participation from citizens and policy implementers. If you have too much withdrawal from policy from either of these groups, you're going to have problems. This is difficult in contemporary liberal democracies where we have intense value-based disagreements. And so basically my message from today is that we need to pay close attention to when people are withdrawing in this way. That's all I'm going to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Katherine, and thank you, Kimberley. Two very interesting talks, and you seem to approach the subject in a pincer movement. Kimberley is sort of more top-down, focusing on abstractions and philosophical conceptual analysis. Katherine is more bottom-up, very close to the fuzziness of empirical reality. And so, by the way, I would like to invite participants to drop questions in the Q&A functionality at the bottom of your screen. And I have many questions. Let me start with Kimberley. And I'm picking up on the very last slide of your presentation about the conscience of corporate bodies. When you look at business ethics literature, there seems to be significant support for some degree of moral responsibility accredited to corporations, as they seem to have some sort of agency, if not a conscience. They seem to have some sort of agency independent of their members. And there are two supporting arguments for this idea. The first is from Peter French, and he says every corporation has a corporate internal decision structure, which directs decisions in line with predetermined goals. And there is this other argument that says all corporations manifest a set of beliefs and values that lay out what is generally regarded as right and wrong within the corporation. It can be very explicit in a code of conduct. It can be more implicit as an organizational culture. But this results in corporate action that is not readily assignable to any individual's decisions. What do you hold of these ideas, and how do they relate to your thinking of about the conscience of corporate bodies?
So the difficulty with any account of conscience is that we're dealing with something others cannot see. The workings of your mind. All we have to go on is the manifestation in behavior. And so you can look at the movements of individuals, the movements of their character, as Aristotle would put it, but you can also look at the movements of collectives. And there are some things we can do as groups that we cannot do alone. I cannot ballroom dance alone. I cannot perform a symphony alone. So when we are part of a collective and we move in the direction of our group, the people making up that collective, they can be held responsible for their contribution. And then the collective as a whole can be judged for what it did and how well it did it. So when I'm a member of the Vienna Philharmonic and we have a really bad performance, you can say about our collective that it didn't perform well. You might be able to then, sort of trace it inward and find the violinist who played the wrong note that sort of set started everybody off and it spiraled downward. And I think the same probably be true in political action, that there are often leaders. You don't need a leader in order to have a collective, but there are often leaders. There are the Nelson Mandelas, there are the Aung San Suu Kyis, and you can look to how they act and give them more responsibility because of their leader position. But leaders need followers, and first followers are very important. The first person who lends credibility to a leader's ideas. So I think it's not the case we've got sort of individuals and collectives. We can start to poke a bit, but it is hard, especially if you have sort of a liberal outlook where the locus of concern is the person. It's hard to get away from a conclusion that really stresses our individual responsibility.
Okay, very interesting, thank you. A question for Katherine. What exactly justifies the moral right to engage in conscientious objection and civil disobedience? You mentioned different potential avenues for justification in your presentation. For example, in order to uphold moral integrity, which seems to be more sort of a deontological consideration. But then you also mentioned that it might be the only manner for some people to be able to participate in democratic life. And participation is necessary for policy and more generally for deliberative democracy to succeed. So this seems to be more utilitarian or pragmatic in its justification. Can you elaborate on this a little bit?
Sure. So something that I hope that I made clear is that there are going to be lots of people doing things for different reasons, that context is going to matter a lot to our account. And I was trying to give like a little sliver across the world to show that you might be a member of the South African shack dwellers movement who is doing this because you have no other way of participating in democratic life. You've sort of been forced into this position. You might be a police officer in a context where you have been told you need to stop people and get them to show them your papers. And so I think this is going to be extremely context dependent. I am resistant, at least in this case, to kind of have any sort of generalized theory that would explain all of these different sorts of actors in different positions. And so I think that depending on who the actor is and what their social location is, that the justification is going to look very different for those people depending on their context. And I suppose I should be clear that when I was talking about moral integrity, I was borrowing Zaka's language in the way that he uses it, which is about being able to like hold yourself together morally. That if you find yourself in what he calls an impossible situation, you are torn in two completely different directions. You want to be a good police officer who has the trust of his community members or her community members, but you also want to do your job well by following the rules. And so you end up being really torn up that way. And so there's a sense in which you can't live your life in this torn way, and you want to have a more unified moral life. And that's what I meant when I was talking about moral integrity in that way. But at least in this case, I'm very resistant of kind of high theory to try and explain all of these very contextually dependent justifications people might give for their actions.
Right. Just to follow up on this, in your analysis, there seem to be two different kinds of participation. So there's participation through traditional channels provided by the structures of liberal democracy. And then there is participation by dissent in case the traditional channels are not accessible. Do you think we should be putting more effort into making the traditional channels more accessible to everybody?
I think that would be great. I think that we end up in these situations precisely because people don't have great access or feel like they don't have great access. And so I think that one way of dealing with a large swathe of these cases, although obviously not all of them because of the contextual variability, is in order to make these channels more accessible. I think that would be excellent.
Right. Okay, back to Kimberley. What are the implications of your analysis of conscience for the evaluation of civil disobedience and conscientious objection? So I'm thinking, for example, of the application of the communicative principle of conscientiousness. So the four tests of consistency, universal judgment, non-evasion, and dialogic effort. Civil disobedience seems to pass those tests more easily than conscientious objection. Is this correct? And does it mean that you would also evaluate those two differently?
So, yeah, the standard line is that we should accommodate private conscientious objection. We should make exemptions to the law for people who, usually on the basis of deep religious belief, do not feel they can follow it. And we tend also to say civilly disobedient actors, they're being strategic. This is political, they should use other options. Sometimes this is tolerable participatory behavior, but it's not as sincere. That's the standard line. I think we should reverse that picture, because the person who engages in civil disobedience they're showing that we are expressive creatures. We want to be able to live our lives in line with our beliefs. We want to be able to show other people there are reasons for what we believe. And someone who is willing to be seen, willing to bear the risk of going to prison for what they believe, we can have more confidence about their sincerity, because the person who's surreptitious would seem to have prioritized self-protection over their cause. Now, this might sound like a very demanding standard that, if you say you have a sincere belief, that has to come above all else. But if you're going to step outside the law, you are saying, I think this is more important than the law. And so if you're not willing to be seen to do it, we can have some doubts about your sincerity. And in my view, that then translates into a defense, a legal defense, a legal excuse. So Jeremy Horder, he's written a book called Excusing Crime. And in that book, he says there should be a demands of, now he uses the word conscience, I would say conviction, a demands of conviction defense. And he thinks it should be for people who engage in private objection. I think it should be for people who engage in civil disobedience. Civil disobedience is very constrained. It's typically nonviolent. It's a very specific type of public breach of law. And I think that kind of action has the best claim to conscientiousness and to accommodation.
Right. So I've got a few questions for both of you. Under what circumstances, if any, is there a moral duty to engage in conscientious objection or civil disobedience?
Katherine?
I was going to nudge towards you first.
So Candice Delmas has written a book called The Duty to Resist, where she argues that not only can we have a duty to engage in civil disobedience, we can have a duty to engage in uncivil disobedience, that we can have good Samaritan duties to try to remedy injustice, and that breach of law, and sometimes not quite so constrained breach of law, can be what's required of us. Several judges, usually at the trial level, not at the appeal level, say there's an important value in civil disobedience. A lot of American judges will reference the civil rights movement and the women's liberation movement as places where people did important work by stepping outside the law, to restart democratic debates, to remind us of what's really important, to show how serious a problem is. That when your microphone's small, sometimes you have to use breach of law to turn the conversation your way.
The next question for both. When, if ever, should conscientious objection be punished? And what are the appropriate sanctions?
So I feel like I'm someone who's not that worried about punishment. I always think that that's for the later panels of lawyers and judges who need to deal with the business of punishing people. I mean, what I'm concerned about is sort of more diagnostic. I'm kind of concerned about why people find themselves in these positions to begin with. And so, I mean, to go back to the previous question a little bit, my response isn't really about a moral duty, but again, about how people find themselves in these situations. There's work done by a philosopher of science called Maya Goldenberg in Canada, who works on vaccine hesitancy. And she argues that the reason people are vaccine hesitant, and she's talking about vaccinating their children with the old MMR vaccine debacle, is because they just can't have a proper conversation with their medical practitioner because there's such like value disagreements that occur there. And then this then ends up becoming a question of like crime and punishment in situations where people want to have forcible vaccination programs. But really, if we could just like trace it back a little bit to the situation where these value conflicts that mean that people just can't bring themselves to go along with what's required of them, that maybe we wouldn't need to get to the legal question just yet.
You want to add anything, Kim, or not?
Just to note that judges take very different views of how serious civil disobedience is. Some judges say it's less serious than ordinary offending. So if you're trespassing in the name of a protest, that's not quite as bad as ordinary trespassing. Some judges say civil disobedience is a philosophical concept. It has nothing to do with the law. You trespassed, that's what we're focusing on. And then there's some judges that say this is worse than ordinary offending because you've improperly arrogated to yourself license to step outside the law to participate politically. In a liberal democracy, you should use the ordinary channels. They're there, they're available. That's what makes a liberal democracy. And so you don't need to take this strategy. It's interesting how divided judges seem to be about that, about whether to punish. And some judges actually will say, well, I'm going to punish the civil disobedient harshly to show that I take them seriously. They're willing to take this risk. I'm going to show that, I'm going to prove their sincerity by punishing them harshly.
Another question for both. So if you look at the history of civil disobedience, there are these well-known cases, Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and so on, and they were focused on promoting the rights of specific groups. And nowadays, civil disobedience seems to be more focused on abstract issues, climate change, foreign policy, globalization. So there's a shift, there seems to be a shift in the goals of civil disobedience. Is that analysis correct, and how do you evaluate that shift?
Katherine?
So I'm not sure that shift has occurred that way. So I think that I think that what we see is an extreme diversity of people engaging in civil disobedient actions. And I mean, I think historically, we've also seen people engaged in civil disobedience for high things like, freedom, the ability to vote. I mean, these are very high ideals. And then we see extremely practical cases of civil disobedience now, in addition to all of these abstract things like climate change. So going back to the example I had at the beginning of my talk of the Shacktivist movement in South Africa, I mean, essentially, at the end of the day, it's about wanting access to a livable life, like very practical things. One of the examples that Spuza Cody talks about, the quote that I had, is that in the area that he lives, there are 6 toilets to 6,000 people. It's a very practical thing to get civilly disobedient about. And so I think that historically we see people being civilly disobedient for very abstract things. And I think now we also see in various contexts people being engaged in very practical examples as well.
Kimberley, do you want to add anything, or?
No, I was just thinking about the students at the University of Manchester who fences were erected around their dorms, ostensibly to regulate passage in and out, but effectively imprisoning the students, and the students tore down the barriers. And so I think I would agree with Katherine that there's a whole host of causes that are animating people. I think one problem with the theory of civil disobedience is that it hasn't provided much of a foundation to make sense of civil disobedience in defense of animals, or in defense of, or in opposition to the climate crisis. John Rawls' account of civil disobedience is very influential in the theoretical debates, and it focuses squarely on his principles of justice, which are about people's rights, people's interests. And so I think the theory needs to catch up in order to make good sense of protest where you're not the victim, or where you're not acting in solidarity with a human victim, but with others.
Right. looking at the means of civil disobedience, there seems to be a shift there as well. But you might not agree with me. For example, there's more activity in cyberspace, hacktivism, all kinds of cyber attacks for the purpose of promoting a political agenda. How do you evaluate that development?
So I think there's some interesting developments that we need to make sense of theoretically. So digital disobedience and also globalized disobedience. If I breach the law here in Canada to oppose a law in England, how should we think about my indirect disobedience? If we all engage in mass protests against a war in another country, some of those protests will be legal, some won't. How do we situate it, and who should be listening to us? Which government should care about our form of protest? And the same is true online, that the jurisdictional boundaries are different, the territorial boundaries don't matter as much. And so you end up with this sort of brave new world of protest where it's not clear to whom you're accountable and who you're asking to listen to you.
Katherine, do you want to add anything?
I mean, I'm in complete agreement with that. I mean, and again, I think that there's some major new developments like digital protest and what to do about the jurisdictional issues. I think that sounds exactly right. But again, I think that there's been like a history of globalized protest against various things. Again, I can't get away from being South African, especially in this discussion. But one of the things that helped dismantle apartheid in South Africa were global sanctions, which weren't examples of being civilly disobedient, really. That was like the law, that was a collective decision that was made, but that was also happening in tandem with students' protests on campuses across the world. And so there was like a mixture of different kinds of activity that occurred. And so I think that we have seen globalized protest on other things before. At least in that case, the South African case, it was clear who you wanted to listen, the South African government. You wanted them to stop being an oppressive regime. But it's more complicated now with things like environmental protest, which is who are the people that need to respond to your activity, and it's difficult to know like what the mark is in terms of the listener, but also what the proposed change sometimes is. Like what would a successful protest outcome look like in that instance?
Okay, I'm aware of the time now. We might perhaps have 1 other minute. And I have a very easy question at the end. So going back to conscientious objection, what do you think is the most important question related to conscientious objection that should be tackled by future philosophical discussion? And you've got like 10 seconds to answer that.
Well, I think I think Maeve was pushing in the right direction with respect to collective action, because that is, especially in the context of globalized protests, digital protests, they're more amorphous, large-scale collective bodies of people who are engaging in significant action, and can the theories make sense of that? And my own struggling efforts show that that it's not easy when you have these very internalized individualistic accounts. It's hard to make sense of that. So I think we need a new, more collectively minded account of conscientiousness.
Katherine?
I think that what I think one of the most important issues is sort of an old one, going at least back to Isaiah Berlin, which is how to cope with deep, real value disagreements. And the reason I think that that's urgent, even though it's a very old problem, like we've known for a long time that coping with value disagreement is hard and sometimes irresolvable, is because what we're seeing is increasing diversity in societies, or at least increasingly recognized diversity in societies, and a willingness to try and accommodate that diversity. And so I think that even though value pluralism is an old problem, I think it's becoming more of a pressing concern.
Okay, so I'm looking at the time. I think this is a good moment to finish the discussion. I want to thank both Kimberley and Katherine. It's very interesting presentations and a very interesting discussion. And I now hand back to Maeve, I think.
Thank you, Bert.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.